Hello, welcome back. Today's video is going to be all about the cell cycle. That is going to be the title of our notes. Okay, the cell cycle is all about the lifespan of a cell, and there are different reasons why a cell needs to replicate. So the cell cycle means the lifespan of a cell, and it basically means when a cell replicates. So I'm going to say the life of a cell and the replication of a cell. Okay, so there are several reasons why a cell needs to replicate, and those reasons are these. Um, Cells replicate for like when you get injured, so for injury. So if you were to get a big cut in your skin, then obviously you need to make new cells to fill in that cut. Okay, and this happens for any kind of injury that you have in your whole body. And I'm talking in terms of a multicellular organism. Okay, a single-celled organism also can replicate and has a cell cycle also. But if a multicellular organism gets injured, then cells are going to fill in the hole. Okay, another reason for a cell to replicate is for growth. Okay, and so we've talked about this in another video before, but when you are born, you are this little tiny being, super cute baby, and you're only this big, but then you grow up to be, tall adult. And so obviously you had to have some cells, fill in from this big to that big. And so anytime any organism is growing, then cells are replicating. Okay, and so those are the reasons why cells will replicate. So what I'm going to do today is just go through the cell cycle for you. And this is basically like when a cell, is born all the way until either it dies or it replicates. Okay, so the whole lifespan of a cell is from birth to either death or replication. Okay. So the way that I'm going to show this is there are different stages in the cell cycle. So I'm just going to write a list out, and then I'm going to kind of draw a picture for you. Okay. So the first stage in the cell cycle is called, okay, there are two major stages in the cell cycle. Okay. And the first stage is called interphase, and that can be broken down into three stages. And so that's what I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so there's two major stages. The first one is called interphase. Oh, interphase. Okay, so stage number one. There's only two. And interphase is broken down into three phases, three parts. And the first phase of interphase is called G1, which stands for gap one. And in gap one, this is when where the cell spends most of its lifetime. Okay, so this is the majority of the time. And whatever cell type it is, it's doing that duty. Okay, it's doing its job, for example. So, you grow up and you have a job and a career, and so this cell, grows up pretty quickly, and then it just does its career, and it's doing its career for most of its life. And so I'm just going to put does its function. And I'll just give you some examples. For example, Um, let's see, a heart cell is going to be beating. It's going to be part of the heart. It's going to just be doing its heart cell thing. Okay. So I'm just going to put some examples into parentheses here. So heart cell, another type of cell would be like a skin cell, and it's just doing its skin cell things. So what skin cells do is they produce some oils or some keratin, and they're protecting you from invaders getting in, protecting you from the outside world. Okay, and then so for example, you have nerve cells, which are your neurons, and they're doing brain things where they're signaling each other, so that you're learning and thinking, and so on, etc. So whatever cell type it is, it's spending most of its life in gap one, and it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is whatever function it's assigned to. Okay, so like liver cells do liver cell things, and like muscle cells do muscle activities, and so on. So most of its life is spent in this phase, which is called G1, and that is in this other phase called interphase. Okay, so interphase is split up into 3 phases. G1 is the first phase, and it spends most of its time here. Okay, so then something happens where there is a trigger where now the cell needs to replicate, and it's like, okay, I got to start getting ready for replication. Okay, so I'm just going to put like a little note here that there is a trigger, okay, or a signal. Trigger to replicate. So what happens is maybe the neighbor cell died because it got too old, and it's like, oh, I need to replace that neighbor. Or there was an injury, got stabbed, and now they're like, oh, I got to fill in that hole. Or, you know, your different parts of your body replicate at different times. So your skin cells, they replicate really quickly, like within a few days, where your heart cells replicate, every few years. So just there's a lifespan, there's a limit to each cell. So maybe it just got too old and now it's triggered to replicate because it's about to die. Whatever the reason, it's got triggered, needs to replicate, it's going to move on to the next phase. And the next phase is called S phase. Okay, I am going to actually just color code these just so we can have some, just for the notes to be nice. Okay, so G1 is the first phase. The next phase is called the S phase. Okay, and S phase stands for synthesis phase. Okay, I'm going to put that in parentheses. Okay, and what synthesis means is to make. Synthesis means like to create or to build. And so there are 2 things that are going to be replicated here. The first thing is all the DNA is going to replicate. We talked about that in a previous video. So I'm going to say there are 2 big things that are synthesized. First one is the DNA gets replicated. Okay, and we talked about that in yesterday's video. And so all that DNA is going to be copied, and then you're going to have 2 copies of the DNA. Another thing gets replicated, and this is called a centrosome. So centrosome, let's write this down and then I'll explain to you what it is. Centrosome gets replicated. Okay, and so the centrosome is this interesting structure in the cell, and what it does is it creates these fibers that are needed for cell replication. Okay, we're going to go into more detail about that in the next video, but I just need to introduce it here. But a centrosome is like this. So I'm going to draw a cell here. Let me just scoot over a little bit. So I'm going to draw the cell right here on the side. And here's the nucleus of the cell, and there is DNA inside the nucleus. Okay, so this is the nucleus, and the DNA has been replicated. So now it's like DNA times 2. So then a centrosome is on the outside of the nucleus, and it looks like this little, like an X shape. It really looks like a barrel, like 2 barrels that are crisscrossed. That's what it looks like. This is a weird structure. It's a weird barrel, 2 barrels that are crossed. Okay, to me they remind me of like root beer barrels that those dogs wear in the Arctic. They carry the root beer, so when you're cold and you need some root beer, it's in the barrel. So there are two, this is what it looks like. This is what one centrosome looks like. All cells have a centrosome. We're going to talk about what they do in the next video, but this centrosome gets replicated. So another one is going to be made, okay? So now we're going to have two of them. So that happens in the S phase, okay? Just so you know. Okay, then we're going to move on to the next phase. The next phase is called G2. G2 phase. And so G2 stands for gap2. And what happens in G2 is it's a giant checkpoint where all these little enzymes are going to check all that DNA that got replicated. And so there's a lot of DNA in our cells. We have about 3 billion nucleotides for human cells. All organisms have a different number. And 3 billion is a lot. And there's a lot of opportunity for mistakes to happen. And so if there are too many mistakes in the DNA, the cell is going to shut down this whole system and actually die. It will actually kill itself. Because if there are too many mutations in the DNA, that could lead to cancer, and that's a problem. So at this G2 point, before the cell replicates, all the DNA is going to get checked. Some mutations are allowed. So there are some mistakes that are going to happen that are fine. But if there's too many, the cell is going to die, okay? So right here, I'm going to write that the cell checks for DNA mutations. DNA mutations that occurred during DNA replication. During DNA replication. Okay? Okay, if there are too many mistakes, I'm going to write this down. If there are too many mutations, then it undergoes this process where it kills itself. And it's called apoptosis. Then the cell undergoes let me scoot up a little bit. I'm going to change the color just because it's a vocabulary word. Apoptosis. Okay, this is cell suicide. And it does this to avoid cancer. Okay, if there are not too many mutations, so if there are only a few mutations, then the cell will go on to the next phase. If there are only a few. If there are only a few mutations, then it gets the green light to continue. Explanation point. And then we go on to the next phase. Okay, so far we have covered interphase. Okay, so interphase has these 3 phases in it. Oops. Interphase has these 3 phases. G1, where the cell spends most of its time, it's just doing its job. Then it goes into S phase. Once the cell realizes it needs to replicate, it's going to replicate all the DNA and then the centrosome, okay, which will be used later. Oops. What the heck? Okay. And then it goes into G2, which is just a checkpoint. It's like, let's check all the DNA that got replicated to make sure there's not too many mistakes. If it's fine, move on to the next phase. The next phase is the number 2 phase of the cell cycle, and that is called the mitotic phase, which stands for mitosis. Okay, so this is the big phase number 2, mitotic phase, where mitosis is going to happen. And mitosis is the whole process of actually splitting the cell into 2 parts. And we're going to talk about that in the next video tomorrow. So that's it for today. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.